Okay, so now we're going to start talking about what we call closing journal entries. These are the last set of journal entries we're going to do in the process, and they are the easiest ones to do because there's only 4 journal entries to do. They're always exactly the same in the same order, and they'll always be the same. So easiest journal entries to do. But before we start that, we need to talk about different types of accounts. So a permanent account or a real account is an account that continually has a balance from year to year. It never closes. So any account name that's on your balance sheet is called a permanent account. For example, cash, supplies, accounts receivable, accounts payable, retained earnings, capital stock. These are all permanent accounts. They never close. We'll never close them. The other accounts are called temporary accounts. Temporary accounts close at the end of the process, and they are such things as my revenues, my expenses, my dividends, and other types of things. And when I talk about closing accounts, it means that I zero them out, and we'll show you how that works. Don't worry, guys. I got you on this. Okay? So the whole thing is called closing process. We're closing the books and we're going to do closing journal entries. After I do my closing journal entries, all of my temporary accounts will have 0 balances. So I'm going to skip over this. We're going to come back. So 4 accounts is all we need to know about. So write this down. Closing process. Step number 1. Number 1, I'm going to close revenues to income summary. Close revenues to income summary. That means, because of the balance on revenues, which is credit, that means I will debit the revenue and credit the income summary. Always debit my revenues, credit my income summary. That's step number 1. I'll explain what income summary is in a minute. Step number 2, close expenses to income summary. Well, if you remember correctly, expenses always have a debit balance. So to close them, I'm going to credit them. So step number 2, credit the expense and debit income summary. Credit the expense and debit income summary. Okay, moving to step 3. We're halfway done of my 4 journal entries. So step number 3 is to close income summary. The problem is this, you don't know what's in it, so you have to balance the income summary account first. Listen, guys, the word income summary is what? A summary of your income. It's nothing more than your revenues and your expenses. And the difference is either called net income or net loss. So before you do step 3, you're going to balance your income summary account. And whatever the balance is in there, you're going to transfer it to retained earnings or close it to retained earnings. So this is the only step that could go one of 2 ways depending on income or depending on loss. So let's talk about net income. If you have a net income, you are going to debit income summary and credit retained earnings. Okay, net income, I'll say it again. Debit income summary, credit retained earnings. Write that down. Should be writing all these down. If I have a net loss, it means I spent more than I made. It's going to be the opposite then. The debit will be to retained earnings and the credit to income summary. And I'll show you how to know the difference in a few minutes. Okay, last step. Step number 4, there's only 4 journal entries. I close dividends to retained earnings. Well, dividends always has a debit balance. So for step 4, you credit the dividends and debit the retained earnings. Credit the dividends and debit the retained earnings. And I'll show you this in a minute. Let's talk about income summary account right now. So here's my income summary account. It's nothing more than think of it as a clearing account or a slush account. Basically, it has no at the beginning. It never has a balance. You'll never see the income summary on any financial statements. Very important to know. Income summary will never show on any financial statements. Quiz question. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 closing entries. Here's what they are, but let's talk about them. So step number 1 is to close revenues to income summary. I know this is kind of a lot. So my normal revenues are right here. They normally have a balance of credit. So to close them, I'm going to debit each account and credit income summary. You should have wrote that down. Debit fees earned and rent revenue, credit income summary. Step 2. Well, you know what? Let me make this bigger, guys. So here's step 1. I'm debiting my revenue accounts, crediting my income statement. Okay. Step 2. Close, let's get over here. Close all my expense accounts. My expense accounts normally have a debit balance. So I'm going to credit all my expenses, add them up, and debit my income summary. Okay? Step 2, I'm going to close my expenses by crediting my expenses, debiting my income summary. Okay. Step 3 is close income summary. But the first thing we need to find out, don't look at this number here. First thing we need to find out is what is the balance? This is my revenue. This is my expenses. To balance it, I would subtract and put over here on this side 7105. So my net income is 7105. So step 3, my net income says debit income summary, credit retained earnings. Okay? And finally, step 4 is to close my dividends accounts. Here's my dividend. Normally has a debit balance, so I would credit my dividends and debit my retained earnings. Okay? I know this is kind of confusing. Here are the actual journal entries in order. So this would be step 1. This is step 2. This is step 3, and this is step 4. Now, while we're here, let's talk about this. Let's talk about right here. Okay, here's how to tell if you have a net income or a net loss. So this is step 1. This is my revenue. This is a total of all these numbers. These are my expenses. This is my revenue. Right away looking, if this number is smaller, you have a net income than this number. If this is smaller than this, you have a net income. If this number was larger than this, you have a net loss. So if this number is larger than this number, you have a net loss. This is just a real quick visual. Okay? So based upon the fact I have a net income, when I get to step 3, this is the only step that could actually change along the way. And because I have a net income, this is what it's going to look like. And here's my step 4. Okay, so this concludes closing entries journal entry. We are now going to continue looking at the rest of the chapter.